Hello and back to a rather chilly workshop today, so this is going to be quite a quick video. As it happens, it's intended to be quite quick because it's really only considering 2 pages of text, which forms part 1 of the Health Protection Coronavirus Restrictions and Requirements Scotland Regulations 2020. This is the text which puts into force all of the various restrictions that are making your life and my life a bit of a misery at the moment to combat this horrific illness which is stalking the land at the moment. This was made, it says, in 1058 on the 11th of September 2020 and was laid before the Parliament at 3 o'clock that afternoon, and it came into force 3 days later. There's no votes. It's a statutory instrument, so it doesn't require a vote. It's just dictated by the Scottish ministers. They make the following regulations, in the words of this text here. So they make the following regulations in exercise of the power conferred by paragraph 1.1 of Schedule 19 of the Coronavirus Act 2020. Now, if you were paying attention in the last video, you would perhaps remember that there is no Schedule 19 in the Coronavirus Act Scotland 2020, and that's because this refers to the UK Act, the Coronavirus Act 2020, and in fact most of it seems to be driven by that piece of legislation and not by the Scottish one. That's our first reference to another piece of legislation, so we're going to be coming across quite a few different pieces of legislation here, so we'll start a little counter just to see how many we do actually come up with just in 2 pages of text. It says here, these regulations are made in response to the serious and imminent threat to public health which is posed by the incidence and spread of coronavirus in Scotland. And we know from the previous piece of legislation that we looked at that coronavirus means the SARS-CoV-2 virus, nothing else, just that. There are several coronaviruses, but it's just this one that we're dealing with. But if it is such a serious and imminent threat, why did they let it lie about in Parliament for 3 days before it came into force? That seems a bit strange. The Scottish ministers consider that the restrictions and requirements imposed by these regulations are proportionate to what they seek to achieve, which is a public health response to that threat. Well, yeah, a public health response. What is the public health response? What is it they're trying to do? And I asked that question in the last video. Nobody seems to know what it is they're actually trying to do. I think there are only 2 ways that they could deal with this, and one is containment, one is elimination. They can't eliminate, and it's been contained for months. It's not been a problem since May, at the very latest, April possibly. So I don't understand why this is going on at all. In accordance with paragraph 6.2 and 3 of Schedule 19 of the Act, that's the UK Act, the Scottish ministers are of the opinion that by reason of urgency it is necessary to make these regulations without a draft having been laid before and approved by a resolution of the Scottish Parliament. So yeah, they make it up, stick it straight in. Now, having said that, there's 3 days between laying it before Parliament and coming into force. So I would have thought if it was that important, during those 3 days, somebody could maybe have had a quick look over them. There's one footnote to this already, and we're talking about the health protection, brackets, coronavirus, brackets, restrictions and requirements, brackets, additional temporary measures, brackets, Scotland, brackets, regulations 2020, which is Scottish Statutory Instrument 2020/318. So there's the first additional piece. So right into the legislation properly. Part 1, Introduction and Review. These regulations may be cited as the health protection, open brackets, coronavirus, brackets, restrictions and requirements, brackets, Scotland, brackets, regulations 2020, and come into force on 14th September 2020. Well, we know that because it says it at the top. That's just a repetition of what was at the top. The regulations apply in Scotland, which seems fair enough, and Scottish airspace. The next part is interpretation, and it's good to have definitions set out right at the start so we know that there's no dubiety about what we're talking about. And as a test manager, I thoroughly endorse that approach. So in these regulations, a child means a person who's under 16 years of age. Fair enough. Constable has the meaning given by section 99.1 of the Police and Fire Reform Scotland Act 2012. It's a policeman and people working for the police in certain circumstances. An emergency responder has the meaning given by section 153A6 of... Now, where would you think emergency responder was defined? It's the Inheritance Tax Act 1984. Contains the appropriate definitions for emergency responder. And in that definition, it also includes the definition for constable. So the previous one that we've looked at is a bit redundant because it's already covered by this one. We have a definition of an extended household, which means two households which have chosen to be treated as a single household for the purpose of these regulations, or the Health Protection, Coronavirus, Restrictions, Scotland, Regulations 2020. Now, presumably that's what they've been calling bubbles. It's fairly pointless because there's no bubble register anywhere. Who's to know whether bubbles change on a day-to-day basis? It's utterly meaningless. But it's a household which is not already chosen to be treated as a single household with any other household. And again, who knows? If you have already chosen, does that mean you're stuck forever with those people? What if you fall out with them? Yeah. Next definition is face covering. And I was going to cover it in this video, but there's fun to be had with this, so we'll cover it in probably the next one. Having talked about an extended household, we now talk about a household. And a household is either one person or it's a lot of people living in the same place. Well, it's fair enough. But it could mean that one person and 17 people are treated all the same. So the extended household could be 2 people, or it could be 35. Doesn't really matter. As long as they're in their bubble, everybody will be happy. Indoors is defined as a place which will be considered to be wholly or substantially enclosed for the purposes of section 4 brackets 2 of the Smoking, Health and Social Care Scotland Act 2005. Under the prohibition of smoking in certain premises Scotland Regulations 2006. There you go. And outdoors is everywhere else. Passenger transport service means a service provided by carriage of passengers by road, railway, tramway, air or sea. I can't really think of any other way to travel. Telekinesis perhaps. So they could just have finished it after the word passengers, a service provided for the carriage of passengers. Why they needed to put in the extra definition, I don't know. It just seems to be the mindset of the people who drew this up. Minute definitions. Passenger transport service premises means off-road premises where a passenger transport service may stop or terminate, allowing passengers on and off. Bus garages included? Don't know. Depends whether they allow passengers on and off in a bus garage, I don't know. A person who is responsible for carrying on a business and similar expressions includes the owner, occupier and manager. Well, that's so loose a definition as to be entirely worthless. I don't know why they bothered putting that in at all. The last paragraph in this section very sensibly says that as soon as the Scottish ministers consider that any of the restrictions or requirements are no longer needed, they must revoke that restriction or requirement, and that makes a lot of sense. So you can see that even just in those couple of pages there's quite a lot of reference to other legislation, and in fact there's more than that, because these things change a lot quicker, a lot more frequently than you would think. The Police and Fire Services Act that we mentioned, there's 19 versions of that. That's just since 2012, so you've got to keep up with those. There's 26 versions of the restrictions and requirements, and that's only this year, and they're changing every few days, so you have to keep up with that as well. And these are all inherently contained within this piece of legislation, and this is just in the first 2 days. So there you are. I think that makes 58 pieces of legislation just in the definitions of the requirements and restrictions. Sorry, restrictions and requirements. But remember, children, ignorance of the law is no excuse.